In this chapter, we will continue our exploration of Keynesian economics and how Keynesian economics can be used as a way to manipulate the business cycle, either during a recession or during an expansion. So as you'll remember, the foundation of the Keynesian model had to do with the consumption function. And that simply identified how much money individuals would spend at different levels of disposable income. And we had a graph that illustrated the point at which we would spend exactly the same amount that we were earning. That would be the equilibrium point. We discussed autonomous and induced consumption, as well as marginal propensity to consume, which is the slope of the consumption function. In this chapter, we're going to extend that theory by adding to the consumption function the sectors called investment, government spending, and net exports. When you add the four parts together, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, you get the aggregate expenditure function. It looks very similar to what we discovered in chapter 17 about the consumption function. We're simply going to take the consumption function and add on top of that investment, government spending, and net exports. And we end up with the aggregate expenditure function. The slope of the aggregate expenditure function is equal to the marginal propensity to consume. Now, we will extend this theory of Keynesian economics by recognizing that while we might be at a certain equilibrium, that equilibrium value might not be the full employment value. So if the full employment GDP is different from where we're at, then we are out of equilibrium. And we tend to indicate that we have some sort of gap between where we're at and where we could be. And we either have an inflationary gap or a recessionary gap. And in both of these gaps, we're going to use the idea of a multiplier to figure out how much does our spending or government spending or investment or net exports, how much does it have to change in order to actually get us to the full employment level gross domestic product, which is where we would desire to be. So the business cycle is essentially this movement around the full employment level, and Keynes believed that we could actually manipulate this business cycle by influencing one of those four sectors. So ultimately, what we discover is the mechanics of making this work are the use of what are known as multipliers. There are two multipliers you will learn about in this chapter, the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier. And in using those multipliers, we can discover how much does our spending or investment or government spending or net exports, how much do they have to change in order to get the economy to move to our full employment level of GDP? So in summary, you should know the formula for aggregate expenditures. How is it calculated? You should understand the difference between an inflationary gap and a recessionary gap, and how we use those multipliers in order to manipulate the business cycle. And Keynesian theories were very predominant from the 1930s up until the 1970s. And we believed that we could use the mathematics of Keynes in order to better understand how to manipulate the business cycle.